Welcome back to the Diet Diaries. This is now the third time I'm attempting to record this podcast. After the first two times, my microphone was on mute, and I look over at GarageBand and there's just a flat line. I'm like, oh shit, this isn't picking up any sound. Okay, here we go. I'm going to keep this episode short and sweet. The last couple of weeks have been more in-depth, kind of deeper, a little bit more heady, kind of conceptual type stuff, and I want this to be specific and to the point and kind of actionable. And what I wanted to talk about today are what I believe are the three most important words in coaching, or versions of these words. And they are experimentation, curiosity, and practice. Because within those words, within the world of those words, is where learning happens, is where we have space, is where we have permission to try things, to make mistakes, to pay attention, to notice, to be aware. It's not about following rules. It's not about rigidity. It's not about compliance or obeying. It's about noticing. And it's about trying different things and figuring out what works for you, right? Experimenting, coming up with an idea and saying, I wonder what would happen if I tried this, and then trying it and then seeing what were the results of that. Were they helpful? Were they not helpful? And then using that information to inform your next experiment. And being curious, right? I wonder what would happen. What would it feel like if I tried this? What would it feel like if I tried that? What feels different when I do this? What feels different when I do that? And by this and that, I mean, it's a huge range of things. When I eat more protein, when I eat less protein, when I don't have fiber versus when I do have fiber, when I eat bigger meals, when I have more snacks, when I have dessert, when I don't have dessert, right? Instead of just following a meal plan or following a rule that you've heard or doing what you did 10 years ago to lose weight, getting curious about what happens, right? With experimentation, with curiosity, that's the space. That's how you create space to make mistakes, to have permission, to not feel trapped, to move out of that all or nothing space, right? This approach really helps you find more of that gray area, more of that in between, which is where you are going to find long-term kind of ease, right? Practicing. It's like, it's not about practice makes perfect. It's about practice makes practice. And practicing inherently leaves room for mistakes. It inherently leaves room for change. It inherently leaves room for improvement. And inherently leaves room that sometimes it's going to go better than other times. Some days are going to be great and some days are going to be shitty. But it's about creating that space for yourself and not locking yourself into something, not expecting yourself to be so perfect and so on track that if you make one mistake, you go off track, right? This language, using this language, and not even just vocally, externally, but internally in the way that you talk to yourself about what you're doing. And these languages key. I use these words very specifically when we have our calls, when we talk about what you're working on, when we talk about how we're approaching something. I'm always using this language because this is how we start to move away from the all or nothing mindset. The I was good or I was bad. I blew it or I was awesome, right? This again is that messy in-between space where you are learning. You have space to notice, to pay attention, to become aware. And that is what coaching is. At its core, it is about experimentation. It is about curiosity. It is about practicing. It's about creating your own guidelines and your own structure. But in order to create your own structure, you have to experiment and figure out what kind of structure works and what doesn't. And something not working is as valuable as something working. And again, right? There's no such thing as the failure. It's just learning and seeing what didn't go well and how does that inform what I want to try or experiment or be curious about next. And so I really encourage you to notice the language you use to talk to yourself and the thought patterns you have around what you're following and what you're doing. Are you following a diet? Are you following a meal plan? How rigid are you being with yourself? How do you talk to yourself when you make a mistake, when something doesn't go according to plan, when you start moving outside of your routine? Are you telling yourself you're off track? Are you telling yourself you've blown it, that you've fallen off the wagon? What would happen if, as a response to those thoughts, you said to yourself, well, let me kind of get curious about why do I think this happened? what do I notice across the last couple of days or even within the course of this day that might have led me to this point, right? You're getting curious. Instead of just labeling the experience as bad, let's get curious about why we are where we are and what can I learn from it? And how does that inform what I can try next to maybe get a different outcome, right? What am I going to experiment with? So this is how you take what I'm talking about and actually put it into action, right? And instead of saying to yourself, oh, I was so good today, I was so on, I ate so clean, maybe it's about, again, responding to that and saying like, I really worked hard at practicing my skills today. And even and maybe today it felt really good and I made a lot of good choices. And another day I practiced my skills and I made shitty choices, or I didn't feel good. Or you know what? I didn't really practice much today. I'm going to practice tomorrow. This is, again, how you start to put these words into practice. And again, this is not a light bulb that goes off. It's not a switch that you flip. It is a slow, progressive change that you make in terms of how you respond to your black and white thinking, your all or nothing thinking, with language like this. To start to slowly repattern that, to start to slowly experience other ways of moving through this. And I know in some ways I'm speaking in kind of vague language, but I'm hoping I'm giving you enough specificity around the specific words, experimentation, curiosity, practice, what to do with them and why they're important, that you can start to notice where thinking and language like this currently shows up for you and where it doesn't, and where there's opportunity to start to incorporate more of it, not by shutting down or ignoring or trying to replace the old way of thinking, or I should say the current way of thinking, but how to respond to that. I've talked about that so much in many other episodes. We can't overtly and instantly change our thoughts. However, we can change how we respond to them, what we do as a response to what we are thinking. And starting to incorporate language like this and giving yourself the space to learn and pay attention, to get curious, to experiment, is what is going to allow you to develop the skills and start to really make a shift from where you are, right? This is what's going to let you move away from counting calories and counting macros and counting points to figuring out what works for you, right? The only way that you move away from those things is if you start to pay attention to how food makes you feel. If you get curious about what happens when you have more protein, less protein, right? I talked about this. If you experiment with, different types of foods to see what you like, see what is more satisfying, less satisfying, right? These words, experimentation, these practices, experimentation, curiosity, practice, are how you move away from a diet, right? There's no magic switch that flips where you're like, oh, I'm just not going to diet anymore. I'm not going to count calories. You have to have something else to do, right? You can't just shut that off. You're like, then, well, what do I do? How do I eat? This is how you learn how to eat. This is how you learn how to trust yourself. This is how you learn how to feel at ease. Is by experimenting, is with curiosity, so that you can notice and create your own way of eating. That's really at its core what this is about. Experimentation, curiosity, practicing allows you, again, I said this before, I'm repeating myself, allows you to create your own structure, allows you to create your own way of eating so that you know what works for you. You are the only person who is like you. What works for you is not going to work exactly for someone else, and vice versa. Might be some similarities, right? We can use some guidelines as a starting point to experiment with. But those guidelines of eat X grams of protein a day, eat X grams of fiber, we can use those again. It can experiment with that. How do you feel when you do eat that? Not do this and that's it, the be all end all. It's very different to say what happens when I try this versus I must do this and this is the only way, right? That is how these things play out separately and how they lead you, how these ways of thinking leads you down very, very different paths over time. I think I'm good. Anything else I think is going to be repetitive. I promise I would keep it short. We're at 10, 11 minutes, right on the nose. Thanks for being here. I appreciate you for listening, and I'll be back next week.